I'm the oldest daughter of Carmelita, who was Ave Maria's first child. And I was in the Peace Corps in South America when I was just out of college. And I was in Paraguay, which is a very rural place. And it was like being in Camarillo 150 years ago, because no running water, no paved roads, just wells for water, and no electricity, a few generators in town, maybe 2 or 3 generators for 1 or 2 hours a day. And we had one telephone in my town that had a runner that would come and get us to go answer the phone. And they had a switchboard in the Capitol, and you'd call, Asuncion, Asuncion, and then they'd answer, and then they'd patch you in to the people that are answering the phone. So I understood from that experience, where I was there for 2 years, what it's like to be starting to have a farm. What is a farm life like? And only 1.3% of Americans are farmers, and only about 3% of our population work on farms. So very few people actually know anymore what it's like to grow up on a real farm from the olden days, that the time of the mid-1850s on, that this thing started. In a time of rain, they closed the roads in my town for 2 weeks to let the road dry out, because the ruts would form if you drove on it. So it changed the way you feel about time. It changed everything. The lack of the kind of things we're used to in America. So I just thought I'm going to read you this part and try to stick to it. Adolfo inherited the land from his father in 1880 with Juan, his younger brother, who was 2 years younger. The farm had been a dry farming operation, mostly raising cattle. The first thing he needed was a horse. If you needed to get to the farm and from the farm and around it to supervise what was happening, you needed to be sure things were okay. So in the beginning, it was like being a cowboy. You'd ride all day and camp at night sometimes, and then come back to town at the end of whatever you were doing. As you wanted to do more, you considered planting fields. You get a buggy or a wagon, which the horse can pull. You may also have an ox cart or oxen. Sometimes you'd use a cart pulled by a horse. You may also have a flock of sheep and some cows and some pigs, and maybe chickens a little later. You take the buggy and the horse and you go to market, which may be quite far away, like Ventura or Santa Barbara even, or even Los Angeles, but that was about a 3-day journey in those days. You buy big quantities, so you won't have to come back for maybe a month or even more. Flour, sugar, dry beans, and rice, and other staples. You bring big bags of them, and that's why the bins in the kitchen are so big, because they would buy a lot at a time, so they didn't have to go back to the market for at least a month, maybe even more. You buy seeds for planting, and you buy food for your family and animals. And then you start to think about building and planting. You think about the shelter for the animals from the weather, especially wind and rain, and from predators like coyotes. You will need to build a barn and some fences. There's not a lot of lumber, so you make some adobe bricks and use mud and straw to make the bricks, and you build a house, and later you can build a bigger house. You hire employees to plant the fields and keep an eye on the ripening crops. If you have cattle, you brand them when they're babies so no one steals your stock. The fields have to be planted to take advantage of rain, because so far there's no well or running water, and later you can add irrigation so more can be done. But in the beginning, it's just dry farming with mostly cattle. After planting, hopefully the rain will water the crops, and then later, after it ripens and the fields dry out, you can harvest it. And you can't take a buggy into a big muddy field because it will get stuck. And I've walked in the kind of mud that your shoes would go down 6 inches and stay there, and your feet would come out, and you couldn't get your shoes out. So I know what it's like to be in those deep mud situations. So you had to wait till it dries out to harvest it. So you needed the oxen or the horses or the donkeys to help pull those big heavy loads of crops onto some sort of road. And the other thing is, if you have chickens, you have to have pens that are strong enough to protect them from coyotes and mountain lions. And even still, I live in Santa Cruz, and my son has a dear friend who has chickens, and the mountain lions got in and killed all his chickens about 2 months ago. You have to have really well-made pens to keep those predators out. And then you need a cow for milk. You need to get the crops to market, so you need roads and wagons that can take the loads to the market. When the train station gets built, you can ship things on the train. One of the first innovations in the 20th century is refrigerated boxcars, so produce can get to market before it spoils. If there are crop failures, you need a friend with money or a bank to help you tide over until the next year's harvest, which hopefully will be abundant, and help pay back the loan. In the 1860s, there was a long drought in California for several years, which added to the losses. So the Ruiz family sold the last piece of their land grant to Juan Sr. in 1864, I think it was. And it was because the drought made it impossible for him to keep paying back the bank for the loans when the crops failed. The drought was so important. So you've heard farmers always talk about when is it going to rain and what's the weather going to be like. And all of this stuff is about planning how to get the plants in, how to get them harvested in the season. So then when you have enough money to build a house, you can get married. You need to get a wife to cook and sew. The food has to be made by hand. There's no easy shortcuts. And the sewing, you take the cloth, you cut it, you start sewing it, you have to make clothes for all the kids. There's no washing machine, you have to do the wash. It's a lot of work, all of that. And then when the children come, you need a nearby school, you need books and teachers so that they also will grow in learning to have skills and be helpful. So all this stuff keeps happening that you need to keep moving forward, being able to make possible. And if someone knows how to tan leather from the cow hides from your cattle, then you can make pants and chaps and boots and hats and saddles and saddlebags, which is another big part of having a farming operation, especially with cattle. And then if you have sheep and you know how to spin, you can get wool and then start knitting to make sweaters and stuff for the winter. So that's how they lived in the time between the late 1700s and the late 1800s. And so I just thought that's a good place to start, because if you are the docents and you're talking to children coming through, you can help them understand what farming was like. Because young children, sometimes they're like, they've only gone to Costco. They have no idea what it would be like to be in a town where there's no store, there's no place to do anything, and how would you learn to cook in that place? What would you do? So I felt like that was a good piece to begin with. And then the second part of the talk is about, so that's the farm in those early days before the house was built, okay? The words from our Declaration of Independence from Thomas Jefferson, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, rang out across the world from 1776 on. So from our revolution, the rest of the world also started having revolutions and struggles to limit the power of kings, to make sure the laws protected the citizens, and to do a better job of governing. So many of the constitutions all around the world were based on our Constitution. The Mexican-American situation was similar, and in the 1812 to 1850, when all these revolutions were going on, the Mexican-American border was above California and above Texas and New Mexico. So Mexico was where we are. But then there was a big war, the Mexican-American War, which is mainly fought over Texas, but the end of it, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 brought Texas and Southwest into and California into the United States. So in 1848, the gold rush started, and people came from all over the world prospecting, and people pouring in from the east helped make California a state because Americans were more numerous, and so they voted to change from California the Republic to California the state. So that's kind of the background of that time. So now we're going to go back up a little bit. In 1834, the Ijar expedition came from Mexico. The Mexican government could see the threat of westward expansion of America. They could see the people coming from the East Coast. And they sent the Ijar expedition of settlers, peaceful settlers, not warriors, not soldiers, to try to hold on to the territory in California, which was under Mexican rule. Juan Camarillo Sr. was in that expedition in 1834 from Mexico City. They came up to California. And he was not a land grantee. He was in the expedition, but he was a tailor. The Rancho Calleguas land grant, which is this land, was given to the Pedro Ruiz family, and because of the droughts in the 1860s, which I talked to you about with the farming thing, caused multiple crop failures, and the family went into debt, and they couldn't crawl out of the debt. And because Juan was a friend of the Pedro Ruiz family, he bought pieces of land when they needed money. And he was a tailor, and he was working, and as more and more settlers came in, he was successful, and he had the money to pay to buy the land. And so the last piece of land was bought in 1876. So the time from the Ijar expedition in 1834 until 1876 was pretty much his lifetime and his friend, the head of the Pedro Ruiz family. And so Rancho Calleguas was 10,000 acres, and it was a land grant, but he bought it from the family that was actually given the land grant. And you probably remember that the Spanish owned Mexico, and there was first a big revolution against Spain in which Maximilian, who was the emperor who was sent from Europe because of Napoleon, he was killed in, I think it was 1810. So Spain had given the first land grants, and then Mexico gave the second batch of land grants. And the reason that this was all going on was that they were trying to see, can they extract more wealth out, and they decided that the Franciscans weren't making them enough money, so they took the mission lands from the Franciscans and they were going to give it to private families, hoping to make more money and keep the area under Mexican cultural and political rule. But it didn't work because all of the Western people coming in from the East Coast into California flooded and overwhelmed that intention. The purchase of the land made it important for the Camarillos to move from Santa Barbara, where they originally settled, to Ventura County. Juan Sr. and Martina Hernandez Camarillo first moved to Ventura near the courthouse. The Camarillos had 14 children, but only 7 made it to adulthood. It was common in those days to have many babies and young children die, various infections and health conditions that could not be taken care of. So it was very sad. But the first 5 of their children were girls, and they were healthy, and they grew, and they were all born in Santa Barbara. And most of them were old enough to be married before Juan and Martina moved to Ventura County because of the purchase of the land. So Adolfo and Juan, who were their youngest two children, they lived after 7 people died in the middle, 5 older girls, and then the last 2 were the boys. And so Juan was born in 1866. Adolfo was born in 1864. 1864 was the year that our revolution, the Civil War, ended. So he was from the end of the Civil War all the way in his lifetime to 1958. So this is when California Republic happened, from right before, this is like the beginning of the gold rush. So for like 2 years, California was a republic. And then it became a state of the United States. And that's the courthouse in San Francisco. This is downtown Ventura in like 1890. Just to show you, you know, how Wild West it was. And this is the wharf in Ventura. So Mr. Wolfson was an entrepreneurial businessman in Ventura County, in Ventura, the town, and he married one of the Camarillo daughters, Francisca. And so he and her father decided to work together on a business project, and it was to build the wharf. The wharf in Ventura was built in 1874. And why would they want that wharf? They needed it because they needed to ship things to market. So they had cowhides and they began to have crops. So having the wharf made it possible for ships to come in, and then they could send them more quickly and more cheaply down to Los Angeles or up to San Francisco, so you could, you know, have better markets for your products. So the crops and the cowhides could be sent that way. And sadly, Francisca, the Camarillo daughter who had married Mr. Wolfson, died in childbirth at age 23. So it just keeps reminding us again of the loss of women to death and childbearing in those early years. So Adolfo and Juan both went to school in Ventura, and then Adolfo went to business school in Los Angeles. And his father died. This is the older Juan Camarillo Sr. He died in 1880. And so Adolfo was 16 when his dad died. So that story of the farming, he's a young kid inheriting this big piece of land that's essentially undeveloped yet. And he has the energy to try to take it on, to become a farmer at that time. So he rode his horse to San Francisco to the court to be certain that the paperwork was correct. Because we went from Spain to Mexico to the United States owning the country, and he had to make sure the paperwork was going to be okay after his dad died. So then he started building the ranch. So he married Isabel, whom he had met in school at the Ventura Mission in 1888. They had 5 children who lived to adulthood. The eldest daughter was Rosa. Then came a daughter who died when she was 11 or 12, named Minerva. And she was just a little bit older than my grandmother, and my grandmother remembered her sadly, always my sister who died. So Ave Maria, my grandmother, was born in 1892. And 1892 was the same year they built the house, the big house. So before that, they lived in a more small adobe house. It was much more humble. And then he was successful enough that they could build the big house. Next, in their children was Isabel, or Isabella, whom they called Noonie. And then Pancho, or Francisco, was the second to the last child. And then their baby was Carmen. So that's the kids of Adolfo and Isabel. Pancho Francisco went to Santa Clara University, and he graduated in 1920. It's so, you know, I'm trying to give you that sense of the time passing and things happening and new people growing up and taking on a life all as time is going by. So Carmen went to college in New York for a time, and she was at Columbia University. And she met F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby and other books, but he was not a Fitzgerald related to my grandfather Fitzgerald, okay? The Fitzgeralds from Camarillo are with a capital G, and his was Fitzgerald with a small g, just so you know. In 1898, the railroad stop came, and then in 1902, I think it was, they finished making the station. And Adolfo gave them enough land for them to put the Southern Pacific Station in Camarillo. And they were going to call it, he wanted them to call it Calleguas because that was the name of the ranch. But the Southern Pacific bosses said, oh, it's too hard to pronounce. We can't say it, and we can't spell it. So we're going to use Camarillo. And of course, Camarillo is not that much easier to pronounce or spell. And so, but we got to get our name on the town because the railroad said that. Okay, so he did try to name it Calleguas. And it made it easy for Juan to go and visit his married sisters. All those sisters that had grown up in Santa Barbara pretty much got married and had big families. And he would go from Santa Barbara to Los Angeles on the train, back and forth, visiting all these cousins and aunts and uncles and keeping up the social life of the family. And then it was a big help to ship crops. You know, once you had the railroad, you could start sending things to San Francisco or Los Angeles on the train, which was a big help. And Rosa and Ave, when they were young, they went to school on the train to San Jose, to the Convent of the Sacred Heart. And that's where Ave got to get music training for her voice. And they both played the piano. And Carmen also played the piano. And so they were able to get to that school far, far away because of the train. Juan stayed with his mother in Ventura at the house with the dry goods store until her death in 1898. They had this nice house in Ventura close to the courthouse, and that's where she had been running this little store, and Juan stayed with her as she got older. And he then, after her death in 1898, he began to travel and learn more about art and architecture, which always had interested him. And he spent time planning the building of the St. Mary Magdalene Chapel in Camarillo. And it was finished in 1914, just as World War I broke out. And so in 1914, he had been sending stuff from Europe for the chapel. And one of the important things was the windows, which were stained glass, made in Munich, that he had ordered. And so you can see this is the front right window in the church, and it's Mary Magdalene washing the feet of Jesus with her hair. And I've always loved that window, and the sun hits it perfectly in the morning. It's just really great. Walk in there sometime and see it. And then as you go up the stairs to the choir loft on the back right corner of the church, you can see this little thing here. This is the guy in Munich who built those stained glass windows, Francis Xavier Zettler. And the thing is that they thought that those windows got lost in the war because World War I happened from 1914 to 1918. But at the end of the war, they found the windows sitting on the end of a wharf in Italy somewhere. They didn't go to the bottom of the sea, and they sent them, and they were put in place in the chapel in 1919, so a year after the end of the war. And then this one I always like too, because it's Mary Magdalene at the resurrection, and that's on the other side, on the left side. So he built that chapel, and then he was traveling, and he was going to Italy, and he went to see the Pope, and he told him he had built this chapel in this town. And the Pope was so excited, he jumped out of his chair and threw his hat in the air. And then he gave the hat, which is called a zucchetto, this little kind of a yarmulke hat, to Juan. And then he gave him an award, which is a kind of a rare award in the church for building a church, which usually it was like princes or kings that would build churches, but he did this one, and so they gave him that award of Saint Sylvester. And so then the next thing was Juan decided to move to Argentina in the years after World War I. And he had a ranch in Cordoba, which was on the north side of Argentina, close to the Paraguayan border. And then he came back in 1924. And he and Adolfo from then on were really close, and they would have daily conversations. They would go, usually have breakfast or lunch together and talk and visit. And he died the same year that Isabel died. They both died in 1936. So that was very hard on Adolfo to lose both his brother and his wife in 1936. And I think that it's not easy for people now to understand there was a social problem. If you were gay, people didn't want you to be out in public. They thought that you should be hiding in the closet. And Juan was gay. He didn't marry, and he was a very artistic person. And part of going to Argentina was to keep the honor of the family and keep it quiet. But when he came back, he was more mature, he was quieter, and it wasn't as hard for Adolfo to understand his brother and welcome him home. So they had a huge party. So this is the picture from the Los Angeles Times in July of 1924 when he came home from Argentina. Everybody in the whole state came, and they had a huge barbecue here at the ranch. So it was like recognizing and welcoming him home and not being mean to him or pejorative. And so I think, to me, it's very exciting that happened, that he was recognized and loved for what he had done, because building the church was great. And also there was a Protestant church, which now I can't remember the name of, but he gave them money for that church because he wanted people to have a place of worship that they felt good about. And then he also gave 100 acres to the Archdiocese of Los Angeles for the seminary, St. John Seminary, which was built in the 30s, the major seminary. Then they built a minor seminary. Now they're back to just having the major seminary here. But it was to train men for the priesthood, because he really had deep faith. And when he built the chapel for his parents, it was partly because of his love of his parents and his love of his faith that he put the chapel together. And so I think, he deserves the love and respect of the family for that. So he died in 1936. And in the time between the 1920s and the 1940s, there's a lot of innovation, and it was the telephone, the lights, and the moving things faster. So both the railroad and the cars, all of that really mattered. And so transportation, communications, and light changed a lot of the ways people did everything. The first time Adolfo went to a trade fair was in Chicago in 1898. So that was the World's Fair picture. Can't see it too well, but anyway. He saw many different innovations in the time of rapid innovations happening. He saw the refrigerator, which he bought for the ranch, and it's next to the kitchen there. And he bought both gas lights and electric lights for the house because it was not obvious yet which would be more convenient as time went on. So he was far thinking ahead about which kind of lights would be the easiest for people to use. He got one of the first telephones in the county. He urged improvement in seeds, farm equipment, and processes, and he learned from other farmers in these world fairs. So he went to Chicago again in 1906, and he later served as the first head of the state fair here in California, partly because he had learned in Chicago how to do it, how to run a fair like that. Having all these farmers come, learning all this equipment that was changing and making things more efficient and better processes. So he was involved every year in the state fair board, but he was the head of the first one in 1931. So tools, irrigation, and planting and seeds. And then the advances in transportation were also a big part of the development of tractors and plows and harvesting equipment. And then when you think about the railroad, in the 1890s, the station was called Camarillo because I told you the Chumash name they thought was too hard to pronounce, Calleguas. But the telephone also came in, and it made it easier for people to find buyers for their markets and plan market deliveries, and people could communicate much faster than by letter, which had sometimes taken weeks to deliver. Family members could talk to each other across long distances. Roads also became improved, and wagons and tires started to be better built. Then the cars were invented and trucks became available, so more things could be shipped. Towns started getting bigger. People had jobs. Things could happen. So all of that innovation was underpinning the effort to build a more modern farm and farm equipment, farm labor, farm better seeds, better everything. So in 1920, Francisco, Adolfo's son, graduated from Santa Clara University. This is a picture of my mother, Carmelita, who was born in 1921 in the Model T. So she was going for a ride with her grandfather, and they took a picture of her. At the same time that those things were happening, irrigation also started to make a huge difference. You had to build wells and then pipe the water to be able to irrigate the crops. So that started happening, and more vegetable crops could happen because of the irrigation. Before dry farming, you had to depend on the rain, and sometimes the rain didn't land, and so we've lived through droughts. We know it's not fun. So all of that was happening at the same time. So then I'm going to go to the next part is the 1920s to the 1960s. So the stallion Sultan, the white horse, was purchased in 1921, which is the year my mother was born. And the icon of Mexican-American love of horses was really what Sultan was. In a way, he was an icon or an image for a Mexican-American family in California, in America, of the more ancient love of horses, love of ranching, and this was a successful ranch, and so that was why Adolfo had that white horse, and then started growing more horses, breeding more horses, in order to start doing the parades. And the traditions of the fancy leather saddles with the silver and the charro costumes. If you see the bridles, the saddles, they're heavily laden with silver, black saddles, and these are, I don't know if you noticed, these blankets, the horse blankets are Arabian, black and white around the edges, and those blankets have lasted 100 years. They're still good, and the saddles are still good. And that's me, and I think I was 25 that year. I was with Melly at the Santa Barbara Fiesta, and it was a great honor to get to ride with my Aunt Carmen in the parades. And not everybody got to ride. You had to know how, and you had to be okay at doing it without falling off your horse or getting in trouble. And so we all had to practice all summer and get the horses ready for the parade. But Melanie was such a big, wonderful help with getting the horses ready for the parades. And he and my mom died within, I think, 2 months of each other. They both made it to 90. So that you can see the silver saddles there, and It's a Mexican custom for the charro, which is like a gentleman on horseback. It's not just a cowboy. It's somebody who's wealthy enough to have very nice leather saddles with decorations with silver or other colored things, and then be able to really ride well, to rope, to run cattle. And big ranches in Mexico had cattle also. So the idea of wearing the charro costumes and having this kind of thing was an important part of being the imagery of the ranch in California. And meanwhile, Adolfo's on every board for a lot of things. So he's on the board for the state fair, he's on the board for the education things, he's talking to senators and people that are running for office, and he's helping build community and make things more effective. So he's constantly thinking about his heritage and making the Mexican side of our heritage important in California history. And so it was really important for my mom, who got to go to Stanford, and my aunt Geraldine, who also used to talk to the docents, that they both got to go to Stanford. They both majored in history. They cared about California history, but also world history and United States history. And they tried to educate people about these things that were part of how we fit into the history of the country and the state. We cared about being honorable Mexican Americans, Californians, and Americans. So then Aunt Rose, my grandmother's oldest sister, Rose Pettit, is the one who designed the original riding costumes. So the original riding costumes were lace boleros and a culotte construction. And the culottes were so they could ride astride instead of side saddle. So the bolero goes to about here. It doesn't go to the waist. And the cut of the dresses with a square neck and a V-shaped waist. So the legs could go over the horse and be draping the dress nicely and not be clumsy looking. But you could move, you could function. And the way the sleeves were, there was a flare at the sleeve of it was kind of shorter on top and then longer on the bottom. So you can see the lace draping. So Rose was very fashionable person, and she designed these costumes, and she did a good job, I think, because they're very distinctive. And then everybody wore a black velvet ribbon with a gold cross, and then they wore a red flower in their hair, either in front or in the back at the nape. So it was visually beautiful when you would see them riding, because they rode astride the horse, not side saddle, and we rode next to each other, not with one person in front and one person in the back. Everybody, all the lineup, coming down the street together. And it was really very visually interesting and exciting to see. So it was very fun to get to do. And from the time my mom was 18 till the time when I was probably, I don't know, close to 30, we got to do this. Carmen, I think, rode in 50 years of parades, both the Santa Barbara Fiesta Parade and the Rose Parade. So let's see, what else? The men wore the charro costumes, but we had more women, and so it was actually useful to have these red satin outfits. And the horses were a huge draw and the best known image of the ranch. And Carmen died in 1987, and so that was the last year that the family rode together in the parades. And if you've seen the movie The Stallion of a Dream, you can see, that's the breed has continued, and so there are people raising them, and also our cousins, the Parkers, are part of that, building the legacy of the white horses. This is a picture of Carmen around probably mid-80s, And she's wearing one of the shawls I love, which is gold on black, and it was, I think, her mother's. And this is a picture of me when I was 5 with Adolfo and my 2 cousins, Bert Lamb and David Lamb. And so, you know, it was just a tremendous thing to get to grow up in this family with this amazing person. And I said to the last time I talked to you guys, it was like he had a GPS in him that was really well built. He did good things with his life. He was kind to people. He wasn't a mean boss. He was cared about his workers. And especially in the Depression, one of the things that they said was that he kept his workers working. He knew that they needed the money to raise their families, and he tried really hard to keep them employed so they could provide for their families. And so people would come up to me at the ranch festivals or his birthday and tell me stories about when they were little, and they'd come and visit him. He'd be sitting out on the porch there, and he'd say, "What did you learn in school today?" And he'd keep them interested in what they were learning so they could tell him. And he wanted people to get educated. He cared about the library. He wanted people to be respectful of their families and their heritage. And it was an important modeling that he did for people, I feel. So it's a hard act to follow. Now, my grandparents were Ave Maria and George. So Rose got married in the chapel, but my grandfather George was in the Army Engineering Corps in France, and he got to come home on leave, and they got married in traveling clothes because he was going back to the front. And so that was 1917. And luckily, he got home from the war in 1918, and they were able to be building a house and living and having their kids. So they had 4 kids. My mother was the oldest. And this is a picture, supposedly it's 1925. I thought it was later. I'm not really sure that whoever put the date there was right, but it's Adolfo and then his children. So this is Nuni. This is Ave, my grandmother. That's Francisco or Pancho. That's Carmen, and that's Rose. And so I've asked people, what do you think? Why isn't Isabel in this picture? And I think it's because she died. So I think that it's actually that it's after Isabel's death, but it may just be that she was in the house and they all came out and got their picture taken. I don't know. But it's a rare picture that the whole family was otherwise together. And then in 1917 was when our grandparents got married, when George was on leave from the front. And then they moved into the house in Santa Rosa Valley. And George worked as a surveyor and engineer. And he also helped Adolfo improve the lima bean crops, for which they won prizes at the fair. His 2 brothers were also helpful in building California. His brother Gerald helped build the Long Beach Harbor. There's a plaque at the harbor somewhere for his work in helping to build that harbor. And again, getting crops to market, building more commerce. And his brother Grattan worked in the area around Pasadena and the Mulholland area. And I think they both worked on the Mulholland area and the Newhall Dam. George was injured with lung injury by mustard gas in the war, in World War I. And he died in 1952. I was a baby. I was only a year old, and I didn't get to know him except through his reputation and stories people would tell later. But he was a very well-read person, and he was an interesting man. And he encouraged my mom and her sister to be interested in history and to read, and so they were able to get to go to college. The 1920s were a good time for growth. Juan, who had gone to Argentina and had the ranch there, came home, and that big party was given for him in 1924. And then the Depression, people were out of work, the stock market crashed, the economy was shrunken. Adolfo got help from the owner of the Bank of A. Levy. Some of you, if you're old timers, remember the Bank of A. Levy was in our area. And A. Levy was taught this friend, and he helped him make it through the Depression to keep the ranch going, to keep the workers hired. And he used to say, they would ask him, well, do you need so many employees? And he said, I don't need them as much as they need me, because they needed a job. And many of the earliest employees came from the Azores and Spain. So you hear Portuguese names and Spanish names in our area from the original employees here. And then in World War II, which was, the early 40s, Hitler's growing fascism in Europe. And our family hero was the son of Rosa and Al Pettit, John Pettit. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Marines, and he was all over the Pacific during the war years. And during the war, there was difficulty getting sugar because of the fighting in the Pacific. And so Hawaiian sugar was hard to come by. And it became a top priority for the war effort to get sugar. So Camarillo started producing more sugar beets, growing more sugar beets, because Oxnard is close to us. And what's in Oxnard? The Oxnard brothers had a sugar beet processing plant. So we were close by, so we could get our sugar beets over there, and they could make sugar out of it for the war effort. So that was a big part of the 40s. And having the advantage of being close to the factory was an important thing. And still, places in California that are producing crops, having the processing plants near you helps you save money on sending the crops to market and, making it viable, the whole thing of producing things. So Francisco, Adolfo's son, died in 1952. He and his wife, Tweety, did not have any children. And my grandfather, George Fitzgerald, died in 1951 when I was 1 year old. Adolfo died in 1958. So that's, go back. And so the picture of Francisco, I love this picture because you can tell he's a little bit of a naughty boy with that cigarette. But he was an interesting man. He was a fun man. He did a lot of puns and jokes, and people loved having him around. He was fun to be with. And he would roar up to Mom's house and out in the valley and take the kids for a ride and in his Jeep. And there was a running joke, I bet you don't have da-da-da in your Jeep. And one time they said, I bet you don't have a waffle iron in your Jeep. And he went into the back of the Jeep and he pulled out a waffle iron. So he was the kind of guy that people liked to hang around with and do things with, and they liked to go hunting together. And he was really fun for my uncles, my mother's brothers, Gerald and Jim, because of all of that, rascalhood, you could say. Adolfo died in 1958, and he wasn't good at planning for the future of the ranch after his own death, because George had died, and that would have been the better person probably for keeping the ranch going. And the person that became the trustee was Harold Burkett, that was Nooney's husband, and he was an architect in Ventura. And so wasn't as good at, he didn't know as much about ranching. And so that was hard. And also the state had a huge tax bill. The tax bill for after Adolfo's death was $21 million. And of course, there was no money to pay that tax bill. There was land and there was a business of farming, but a lot of the land had to be sold in order to pay the tax bill. And then some people were able to keep their peace and keep farming it. And my family, the Fitzgeralds, have still continued to farm out in the Santa Rosa Valley. And the Lambs also continued to farm. My mother's cousin, Susanna, married Bert and David Lamb's dad, Bob Lamb. And so their part is still being farmed as well. But, you got to have people who are willing to do the work, daily work of doing farming, and it's not easy. It's hard, and there's times when there's bad weather and times when the crops fail. And one time there was a freeze and the avocados didn't grow, and we had to replant the trees, and several years went by before a new crop was available because the trees have to grow big enough before they can produce fruit. So there's a lot of ifs and difficulties with the idea of farming that some people don't know because they've just never had to deal with it. But that continues to be a problem, and part of what's going on now. And another big problem that is going on now is water use, because in town, people need water. The more people you have, the more water is needed for just the use of people. So then it's natural antagonism happens between ranchers who need the water for the crops and people who need the water for their houses and their businesses and what's going on. So as California gets more and more populated, this becomes a bigger issue and more hard. So I think that's about it. My grandfather died, in 1951. My grandmother lived until 1972. She died just before I got back from the Peace Corps. But she sang this song all the time. And this is a lovely story too about my dad and my grandmother. My dad was dating my mother, and my mother invited him to come meet her parents. He was terrified. And so they came out to the ranch, and my grandmother's music and piano were there when he walked into the house. And he said, "Can I play the piano?" And my mother said yes. My grandmother wasn't in the doorway. She was in the back of the house, and she heard the piano, and she came from the back of the house singing and stood by my dad, hand on his shoulder, singing for about 20 minutes before they even said hello to each other. So my grandmother would make up names for people, and her name for my dad was Our Father who art in heaven, because it was music. Music was heaven for them both. So this is the song that she would sing for my grandfather because he was away in World War I during their courtship. So it's called Forgotten, and it's from that World War I era. Forgotten you well, if forgetting, be thinking all the day, and counting the hours since you left me. Days seem years with you away. Forgotten you well, if forgetting, be searching each face that I see, with eyes that mark never a feature, save yours as you last looked at me. Oh, the wild wish to see you and hear you, to be held in your arms again. If this be forgetting, you're right, dear, and I have forgotten you then. Forgotten you well, if forgetting, be yearning with all my heart, with a longing half pain and half rapture, for the time when we never shall part. Forgotten you well, if forgetting, be yearning with all my heart, with a longing half pain and half rapture, for the time when we never shall part. Oh, the wild wish to see you and hear you, to be held in your arms again. If this be forgetting, you're right, dear, and I have forgotten you then, forgotten you say.
So Martina's mind is like a steel trap and can remember. We're very lucky we have her because she really is the family historian. And the fact that she can whip up a song from what, 1931?
1920.
1920. I mean, sorry. She just told me that. I already forgot. It's very impressive. We're very lucky that you remember these things. And I'm doing my best to try to take notes as you do these things.
I never could sing as well as my grandmother, but I did write songs and play the guitar when I was young, and I wrote the music for my sister's weddings. And so that was another big piece for me of connecting to my grandmother and why I felt so close to her. Thank you for listening and being here. Thank you. Thank you.